I'm Steve Otieno. This is For Nation Reports podcast series, and welcome so much to this show. Today we'll be having with us Dr. Solomon Derso, the founding director of Amani Africa, based in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia. He's an expert in matters governance in Africa, representing so many Africans of the AU. And this is his passion. So today we are with him here in Nairobi, Kenya, and I just want to welcome you to this show. So thank you so much,
Good
Dr.
to be here, Steve.
It's good to see you after almost a year.
Exactly.
Since we last met
Yes,
January in Addis, Ethiopia.
And last time I welcomed you to my space.
Yes,
this
today.
time around you are avenging by
Yeah.
welcoming me to your space. Yeah,
Sure,
good to be here.
and
Thanks.
And thank you so much for giving us this honor. So, Doc, you are coming to Nairobi at a very crucial time for East Africa. We are having Somalia planning to join EAC, the East African Community. Basically, everything is set. It's just joining. What are your 2 cents on this, considering it's a country that has been having so many challenges with stability?
I think it's a very important step in the journey of the East African community in consolidating and expanding the membership of the region. Yes, Somalia has been struggling with conflict for a few decades now. But with the support of the African Union, with the deployment of the African Union mission in Somalia, and with the political process supported by neighboring countries as well as IGAD and the UN, Somalia is in a much better place today than, for example, a decade ago. And this progress that Somalia had achieved obviously is fragile. We still have Al-Shabaab and the fight against Al-Shabaab. Political consolidation is still fragile. So there is still a long way to go in terms of overcoming this challenge for Somalia. But the integration of Somalia into the East African community can also help in bringing a much needed mobilization of support and political engagement from the wider East African community to help overcome the crisis in Somalia, and ultimately, of course, bring in the market that also Somalia has into the East African community.
Wow. Thank you for that. And they're struggling with stability. That's why AU deployed so many soldiers there. There have been plans to have a drawdown from as early as last year. To date, not yet effected. Do you think Somalia is ready for a drawdown?
Look, all indications are that the process for winding down the African Union troops from Somalia and handing over security responsibility to Somali security forces is not yet fully in place, right? The drawdown has been organized in different phases. Phase 1 drawdown was extended for 6 months. Phase 2 drawdown also as a result of the setback that the Somali government faced in the fight against Al-Shabaab has been extended, basically what they call a 3 months pause, technical pause. So you have a total of 9 months slowing down of the drawdown process. At the same time, I mean, that is indicative of the fact that we haven't made enough progress in terms of 2 things. The Somali security forces are fighting Al-Shabaab in order to liberate areas that are still under the stronghold of Al-Shabaab, right? At the same time, they have also to take over responsibilities from ATMIS troops. So they are basically stretched in that sense. This responsibility, assuming full responsibility for security, while at the same time fighting, basically have stretched them. So one of the things that needs to happen is basically to find a way of extending the presence of ATMIS forces until such time that the capacity of Somali security forces is consolidated and they are able to mobilize enough soldiers, both at the national and the federal state levels, that would then be able to be the ones taking over responsibility for Somalia's security. So there is some time that is required in order to facilitate these critical steps that would make it possible for Somali security forces to take over and for ATMIS forces then to vacate and withdraw.
Okay. And perhaps, is there a danger in always having these drawdowns postponed? What will it look like in the long term if a year goes to 2 or 3? Will Somalia ever be stable on its own?
Look, there are a few things that obviously need to happen. One of them have to do with the consolidation of the security infrastructure of Somalia, because ultimately, for Somalia as well as the region, the most important aspect is the fact that Somalia is able to assume full responsibility for security. It is then that both Somalia and the region can be able to work together in narrowing down the space and ultimately squeezing out Al-Shabaab from Somalia and the region. That is extremely important. Second, and not any less important, perhaps more important, is having a clear strategy that would consist of enhancing legitimate local governance structures that would provide the requisite security, justice, and other public services for communities who have been affected and have been under the stronghold of Al-Shabaab, without such kind of creating and rolling out local government structures that are legitimate and able to deliver those services. There would still be a vacuum that groups like Al-Shabaab can easily take advantage of. That's why you need to have a very solid stabilization strategy that is focused on stabilizing regions through rolling out legitimate local government structures, as well as through reconciliation processes.
Wow, thank you for that. Even before we seek to understand ending terrorism in Africa, perhaps what are the key drivers of conflict? In Southern Africa, relatively peaceful until 2017, Cabo Delgado. When you come to Kenya, it's been perennial since 2010. East Africa, in West, the Sahel is now even getting worse. So what are the key drivers, in your opinion, for conflict, especially armed conflict and terrorism in Africa?
So there are an intersection of factors that actually contribute to the eruption and expansion of conflicts. Even those that we call terrorism-related insecurities, they are part and parcel of a conflict system, actually. And these factors include, obviously, first and foremost, bad governance that creates the conditions for breakdown of state-society relationship and the rupture of the social contract, where the state is not governed well, where the state is actually failing and unable to meet its obligations towards its citizens. When you have pervasive socioeconomic and security deprivation, that creates the social and political ills that actually facilitate the emergence of insecurities, the emergence of groups, including terrorist groups. So it is a range of factors. I mean, obviously, in the African setting, you have the failure of national governments. You have politics of inequality and corruption. You also have the burden of history that also plays itself out. Issues relating to the capacity to deliver on obligations by the state. I mean, this is actually not just an internal problem, but also it is a problem of history and current international economic relations of African states and the international economic system. So, I mean, quite a range of factors. And complicating this already existing fragilities and conditions are issues such as, for example, climate change,
Exactly,
right?
yeah.
So it has become increasingly an accelerator
Yeah.
of insecurities and also one that actually makes the resolution of conflict much more difficult. So it is really quite a mix
A
of
whole range of
factors.
factors.
Exactly. Yeah.
And it's good you've mentioned climate change. You know, a few years back, no one would have thought that there's actually a nexus between climate change and driving conflict. But as we are seeing in the countries, especially those with weaker structures in governance and even development, whenever there is a crisis that's coming from nature, they tend to be on the worst end of the stick. So just let's go deeper into climate change. How is climate change a big driver of armed conflict and insecurity in Africa?
I think it's important to start by saying that the relationship between climate and conflict or security, the climate security nexus, is not one of causational.
Yeah.
All right, it is one of correlational.
Correlational.
I think it's important to emphasize that we are not suggesting that climate change
causes.
leads to or causes, conflict.
Yeah.
Right.
But rather interlinked.
Exactly. So climate change induced weather conditions
Yes.
of various kinds lead to the depletion of natural resources.
Yes.
Resources on which many communities depend
scarce.
for their livelihoods.
Yeah.
With the scarcity of resources, one of the consequences would be the scramble of communities over those scarce resources. If that scramble, if that competition over ever increasingly depleting resources is not managed in a way that avoids or that is able to prevent that competition from erupting into violent conflict, then you'd end up having those conflicts because of this competition over resources. So here you have a situation where in the face of the depletion of the resources on which various communities depend for their livelihoods and their basically survival, what kind of governance structure do you need to put in place in order to ensure that this competition doesn't lead to and trigger violence and conflict? So that is one dimension of
climate change and security.
Exactly, the relationship. The other one has to do with how climate change aggravates existing fragilities. All right.
Yeah.
So if you have conditions of inequality between different communities and conditions of tension, all right, when climate change is added to those conditions, it can easily create the conditions for triggering, basically for pushing those conditions into creating violence and conflict. So it is how it accelerates and exacerbates existing conditions of tension that I think we have also to take account of. It also affects conflict in another way. For example, with respect to how you go about resolving conflicts. So climate change induced weather conditions, extreme weather conditions, can interfere with processes for resolving and settling conflicts. So basically you wouldn't be able to for example, with respect to the implementation of peace agreements. One of the factors that contributed to the delay in the effective implementation of the peace agreement in South Sudan is the various weather events involving flooding that led
Yes.
to displacement of people, and therefore making it difficult to engage meaningfully and fully, focusing fully on the implementation of the peace agreement. So you have also that dimension of the process, right?
Yeah.
We have produced, a dispatch,
Yeah.
a video cast that tried to also
Explain.
explain the other way of the relationship. It's not
Yes.
just one directional, the relationship.
Yeah.
That climate affects conflict. That's
Yeah.
not the only dimension. Conflict also contributes or exacerbates
Yeah.
the negative consequences of extreme weather events
Yes.
induced by climate change.
Yes.
So we have seen this playing itself out recently in the devastating flooding that took place in Derna, Libya.
Libya, exactly.
That you clearly see that the fact that Libya is
Already.
fragile and conflict affected country
Yeah.
meant that resources and attention was not invested in
Development of infrastructure.
actually, investing in refurbishing and
Yes.
also consolidating existing infrastructures.
Yeah.
All right. So the fact that two dams were not
Maintained as they
maintained
should have.
as they should have been,
Yeah.
basically what it did was it turned that extreme weather condition into the catastrophe that it has become.
Yeah.
So two things that you see there. First, the lack of investment in the maintenance of the two dams.
Yeah.
Second, the lack of preparedness to even alert people
Residents,
on the
yeah.
line of fire, so to speak,
Yeah.
as the floods were coming.
Washing over.
Exactly. So fragility and bad governance, as well as conflict, basically what they lead to is lack of investment in the maintenance of critical infrastructure,
Yeah.
and not being able also to have the necessary early warning in order to enable
Counter.
communities
Yes.
to actually protect themselves and also get away from areas that that could have minimized the scale
Yeah.
of the destruction
That came with the
and the loss of
floods.
lives that happened in Derna.
Derna, Libya.
But the absence of that actually turned that really tragic flooding event into the catastrophe that Derna has turned into.
Yeah, it's true. Even in Kenya, we felt the brunt of climate change when people had to cross over from the Somalian border to our northern parts. And basically the first quarter of this year was full of killings in the northern parts of the country. And we see there's climate change. We see there's poor governance structures. We see there is movement of illicit goods, smuggling of guns. And perhaps it begs the question, what is AU doing to coordinate all its efforts of bringing peace to the continent?
So various structures obviously play a very crucial role in addressing these various dynamics of insecurity and conflict. The African Union, as the continental policy-making body and platform for taking decisions, but also investing in the prevention, management, and resolution of conflict, contributes to promoting security through various engagements. One of the forms of that engagement have to do with, for example, mediation. And through mediation interventions, the African Union can contribute to that.
Yeah.
Another one, which we mentioned earlier on with respect to Somalia, is the deployment of
Troops.
peacekeeping operations that enable national authorities to regain control over their territories, but also to create the space for national authorities and national stakeholders to engage in peacemaking and also national dialogue and reconciliation processes for fully restoring stability in the country concerned. These are the kinds of things that the African Union can bring to the table, basically mobilizing, if you like, the diplomatic, political, and peace and security instruments and resources from its membership, as well as from its engagement and partnership with international actors such as the United Nations. Those are the kinds of things that the African Union brings to the table. And
yeah, thank you, Doc. You are the founding director of Amani Africa. You've done a lot of research on conflict in Africa. Perhaps what is Amani's recommendations to bring an end to this constant cycle of war in Africa?
There is no,
One-off solution.
silver bullet
Yeah.
for this.
Ending conflict in Africa. Yeah.
Exactly. But I think it requires the exertion of the maximum possible effort on the part of wide range of stakeholders. I think that is a very critical aspect of it.
Yeah.
First and foremost, I think it's extremely important at the national level, because that is where how public affairs are managed at the national level is the key, or as to whether or not a country actually faces and experiences violence and conflict. So the need for having national governance systems that are effective, that are able to deliver on social services, that are responsive to the needs and demands of the wider public, that serve the public equally, all right, without discrimination, that are clean. The existence of these are a prerequisite for preventing the eruption of conflict, for preventing insecurity in any country. And for this, understandably, national stakeholders, play or hold the lion's share of responsibility. We are talking about those who have been interested with the role of being in government, first and foremost. Okay, much of the responsibility lies with them, because in holding the instruments of government and power, they have the most responsibility in order to work with other sectors of society to create those conditions that make it possible for the state to fulfill its obligations towards its citizens, and also, understandably, of course, to ensure that any points of grievances are effectively dealt with through political processes or through independent judicial processes. We need to have effective dispute settlement mechanisms that consist of political dimensions, for the political dimension of things, but also legal dimension of things, or extra legal, dispute settlement mechanism. I think we need to have really very robust, credible, and trustworthy dispute settlement processes and mechanisms. The role of various actors in facilitating these is very crucial. And ultimately, of course, I think enhancing the effectiveness of the state in delivering social services, I think more than anything else, is very critical in deepening and consolidating that bond of relationship between state and society, in reaffirming and creating legitimate social contract between state and society. Those are extremely critical. At the continental level, of course, I think institutions like the African Union, they also bear responsibility in order to facilitate through the exercise of diplomatic, first and foremost, that is their DNA, diplomacy, built on really very fine technical competence, very dispassionate and impartial engagement with actors. Those are the kinds of requirements. So in terms of really going about addressing the threat of conflicts on the continent, strategically speaking, you need to have a very sustained and robust strategy for resolving existing conflicts. So what are we doing with the existing conflicts? Do we have the kind of strategy and intervention? And are we intervening at the scale and speed that is required in order to contain the situation and create the conditions for its resolution?
Yeah.
This is a very critical question.
Yeah.
The second one is to ensure that no new conflicts erupt, and therefore investing in prevention.
Prevention measures.
So those are the kinds of things that actually we try to work on and advocate, and indeed through our research work try to bring proposals on how these interventions can be mobilized.
Yeah. And our dear listener, you may not know, Dr. Solomon has a flight to catch, but is passionate about climate change, governance, and insecurity in Africa. So before he leaves, he'll have to tell us the discussion on climate financing. Africa, we emit the least but affected the worst. There has been calls, including by our President William Ruto, to have fair financial structures, but a day after he delivered his speech, the next day, most of the countries giving Africa loans voted against fair international financial structures. How much funding do we need, and who should pay for it to mitigate climate change effects in Africa?
Quite, some countries actually, according to work done by UNECA and the African Union, some countries pay as much double digit of their GDP in response to climate crisis.
Yeah.
All right. That is the substantial amount of money that is going for responding to climate crisis.
Yeah.
And from countries that do not have really the resources for investing in that kind of response.
Yeah.
These are countries that need every penny channeled into addressing the social and economic well-being of the masses of the people who really still struggle to live a dignified life because of the socioeconomic deprivation that is pervasive on our continent, right? So, the scale of it is really very, very significant. That is why the question of if you are not responsible for events, and if there are actors who are responsible for those events or who have
contributed
who bore exactly who bear the substantial burden in terms of emissions, green gas house emissions, then obviously there is that responsibility that comes, and that has been established through the climate policy making processes and negotiations, that they have to actually, that's why the loss and damage fund that was decided in COP27 in Sharm el-Sheikh. It is, a decision on the right direction that is meant to exactly compensate those countries who are affected the most while contributing the least for climate change. All right. Where we have a problem in terms of really the question of the sourcing is, pledges are made by countries. For example, the 100 billion US dollars pledge for financing adaptation. That hasn't been fulfilled. We have created a new fund on loss and damage. Now, one of the questions for COP28 is where the source of this funding for loss and damage is going to come. Of course, the loss and damage fund is directly related with the responsibility that we made reference to earlier on. There is a lot of conversation and talk about private actors or the private sector contributing towards that, but the experience so far doesn't really provide enough evidence to suggest that there is going to be the kind of funding at scale and speed that is going to come from the private sector. So we are actually facing an existential crisis, not just as countries most affected by climate crisis, despite their limited or no contribution to climate change. As the human family, we are on an existential trajectory at this point in time. And part of the challenge today is really to be able to mobilize that sense of responsibility and urgency, and for governments and of course business to really come to the table, to step up to and rise to this occasion and assume full responsibility based on their shared contribution and burden vis-a-vis the climate change crisis. I think there is every reason that this is what needs to happen. The other source that is being talked about is basically some of the tax arrangements that can be put in place, such as, for example, taxes on for the use of fossil fuel, particularly fossil fuel companies. I think there is a lot of that debate around that. For Africa, obviously, a balance has to be stricken between climate change action and the possibility of ensuring that the development needs of the continent is not compromised as well.
Yeah, wow, thank you so much. You see, that is it with Dr. Solomon Resso from Addis Ababa, Ethiopia, the founding director of Amani Africa. And so we'll have to close it there. He has a flight to catch in the next hour or so, and we really appreciate his time. You will get this podcast at nation.africa podcast series, and feel free every time to drop in your comments and enjoy the wonderful podcasts that we prepare for you. Thank you so much, Dr. Adresso.
Thank you very much, Steve.
Good to be
here with you.
Thank you so much. I hope you get to that flight without further delays.
Definitely, sure.
And also our viewers, stay tuned in. This was your host, Steve Otieno, at Nation Podcast Series. Thank you. Until next time.